When an atheist professor publicly mocked Jesus Christ in front of JD Vance, he thought it would be an easy win. But what he got instead was total humiliation. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It happened at one of those prestigious academic conferences where America's brightest minds gather. The kind of event where professors love to show off their intellectual superiority and progressive ideals. Among the attendees was Senator JD Vance, invited as a distinguished speaker to discuss his journey from humble beginnings to political prominence. Professor Richard Dawkins was known throughout academic circles for his sharp wit and sharper tongue. A self-proclaimed champion of modern thinking, he had made quite a name for himself by ridiculing traditional values, particularly Christian beliefs. His lectures weren't just classes, they were performances where faith was the punchline and God was the joke. As attendees filed into the grand lecture hall that morning, there was already a buzz in the air. Professor Dawkins's reputation preceded him, and everyone knew his comments were more like intellectual gladiator matches. What they didn't know was that today's match would have an unexpected champion. The conference began with the usual formalities: introductions, acknowledgments, and polite applause. JD Vance sat in the front row, his expression thoughtful but reserved. The moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, introduced the day's topic: Religion and Policy in Modern America, Finding Common Ground. Professor Dawkins was the first panelist to speak. He began his address with his usual flair, pacing the front of the stage like a predator sizing up its prey. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Professor Dawkins declared, folding his arms across his chest. "Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief. In simpler terms, for those who might need it," he smirked, looking directly at several conservative attendees, "the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies." Several audience members shifted uncomfortably as Professor Dawkins pulled up a graph on the screen. "See this declining line? This is what happens to religious belief as IQ and education levels rise. Fascinating, isn't it? Though I suppose some people's family traditions," another pointed look at the conservative side of the room, "make it harder for them to accept basic cognitive development." From her position at the moderator's table, Dr. Chen watched with growing concern as Dawkins crossed line after line. She'd seen him be provocative before, but this was different. This was personal. "You know what I find truly remarkable," Dawkins continued, his voice dripping with intellectual superiority. "In this room, we have some of the brightest minds in America, future scientists, leaders, thinkers, yet I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." Senator Vance sat perfectly still, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Unlike the other attendees who either nervously laughed or stared at their notepads, he met the professor's gaze with unwavering composure. This seemed to fuel Dawkins's contempt even further. "Tell me," he challenged, removing his glasses and leaning forward on his podium, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025? When their cognitive development is so stunted that they need fairy tales to explain the world?" His eyes locked onto Vance. "Perhaps some of our more politically connected attendees would care to enlighten us? Senator Vance, I understand you've spoken about your Christian faith quite openly. How do you reconcile that with, well, reality?" The tension in the room was palpable. Attendees watched breathlessly as the professor's thinly veiled attack hung in the air. But none of them, not even Dawkins himself, was prepared for what happened when JD Vance finally stood up. "Thank you, Professor." Vance's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. "I would be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A smirk spread across Professor Dawkins' face. Well, Senator Vance wants to educate us about intellectual capacity," he gestured theatrically. "Please enlighten us about how your Jesus fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." "First," Vance replied, maintaining his composure, "I find it interesting that someone who champions intellectual discourse would resort to mockery instead of actual academic discussion." A few gasps echoed through the lecture hall. "But since you brought up cognitive development," Dawkins' smirk faltered slightly, This wasn't the fumbling response he'd expected. "Oh, please," he interrupted. "Spare us the Sunday school lessons. I've spent 40 years studying science and evolution. Are you suggesting you know better?" "I'm suggesting," Vance continued, his voice gaining strength, "that your bias is showing, Professor. You claim to follow the evidence, yet you ignore the countless brilliant minds throughout history and today who reconciled faith and reason. Newton, Planck, Collins. Ancient history," Dawkins scoffed. "Is God a magician too? Is that what you're going to tell us next?" His attempt at humor fell flat as attendees watched Vance's collected response. "You know what's fascinating, Professor." Vance stood straighter, moving toward the central stage. "You mock faith while displaying your own kind of religious devotion, a blind faith in your own intellectual superiority. You've created your own form of dogma, where anyone who disagrees with you must be cognitively inferior." The room fell silent. Dr. Chen leaned forward in her seat, watching the professor's face redden. Dawkins hadn't expected this level of articulation, this calm dismantling of his assumptions. His next words came out almost as a snarl. "Fine, Senator Vance. You want to debate? Let's debate. Come up here and explain to us all how your medieval beliefs survive scientific scrutiny. Show us this superior intellect of yours." As Vance began making his way to the central podium, no one could have predicted how this challenge would end. Least of all, Professor Dawkins himself. The lecture hall fell silent as Vance took his position at the podium. Professor Dawkins's stance was triumphant, clearly anticipating an easy victory over this backwards politician. But something in Vance's calm demeanor made a few attendees exchange worried glances. "Since you mentioned science earlier," Vance began, his voice clear and steady, "let's start there. You claim faith is incompatible with modern science, yet the scientific method itself was largely developed by people of faith seeking to understand God's creation." "Oh, please," Dawkins interrupted. "Don't try to use historical—" "I'm not finished, Professor," Vance continued politely but firmly. "You spoke about cognitive development. Let's discuss that. You argue that belief in God indicates lower intelligence, yet you ignore the extensive research showing that faith often correlates with higher resilience, stronger community bonds, and better mental health outcomes." Dawkins' face twitched. This wasn't going according to his plan. "Correlation doesn't equal causation," he retorted. "Exactly my point, Professor. Yet you had no problem implying causation when it suited your argument about IQ and religious belief." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Dr. Chen watched as the professor's confident smirk began to fade. "But let's address your real issue," Vance continued. "You're not really angry at God or religion. You're angry at what you perceive as intellectual weakness. So let me ask you this. What's more intellectually honest, admitting there might be things beyond our current understanding, or arrogantly claiming we figured it all out?" Dawkins' face reddened. "That's not—" "When you mock faith," Vance pressed on, "you're not just mocking me or my beliefs. You're mocking the billions of people throughout history who found meaning, purpose, and profound truth in their relationship with God. Including, I might add, many of the scientists whose shoulders you stand on." The professor's composure was cracking. He hadn't expected this level of articulation, this calm dismantling of his assumptions. Attendees who had been smirking earlier were now watching Vance with growing respect. "So tell me, Professor," Vance's voice took on an edge of challenge, "what's more indicative of stunted cognitive development? Believing in a higher power, or believing that mockery is a substitute for actual intellectual discourse?" The room held its breath. Professor Dawkins opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his career, he found himself completely unprepared for what was coming next. Professor Dawkins gripped the podium, his knuckles white. You're twisting things," he sputtered. "Science has explained everything that religion once claimed was divine intervention." "Has it?" Vance's response was measured. "Then perhaps you can explain consciousness, Professor, the origin of life itself, why the universe's physical constants are perfectly tuned for life to exist. Those are just gaps in our current knowledge." "Exactly," Vance interjected, "gaps in our knowledge. Yet you're so certain that nothing divine could possibly exist within those gaps. Isn't that itself a form of blind faith? The audience was completely captivated now. Several attendees who had laughed at Dawkins's earlier mockery were nodding along with Vance's points. But let's talk about your real argument, Vance continued. You suggest that faith is a crutch for the intellectually weak, yet here you are, using your academic position as a crutch to bully those who disagree with you. Which one shows more intellectual insecurity, Professor? Dawkins's face had turned a deep shade of red now. Now listen here, you— No, Professor. You listen. Vance's voice was firm but respectful. You claim to champion free thinking, yet you ridicule anyone who thinks freely enough to disagree with you. You preach intellectual superiority while displaying intellectual intolerance. The tension in the room was electric. Dr. Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, seeing the professor's carefully cultivated authority crumbling before her eyes. So here's my question for you. Vance paused, his gaze steady. If belief in God is such a sign of intellectual weakness, why are you so threatened by it? Dawkins opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the room was deafening as Vance prepared to deliver his final argument, one that would leave the professor wishing he'd never started this confrontation. I'll tell you why you're threatened, Professor. Vance's voice carried clearly through the silent hall. Because deep down, you know that your entire worldview rests on a fundamental contradiction. Dawkins gripped the podium tighter. What contradiction? You claim to follow evidence and reason, yet you've made an absolute negative claim, that God cannot exist. Any true scientist knows that proving a negative is impossible, so your certainty isn't scientific at all, it's dogmatic. The professor's face paled slightly. Attendees who had been taking notes were now just watching, transfixed. Furthermore, Vance continued, you mock people for finding meaning in faith, while you've turned your own atheism into a kind of religion. You preach it with the same fervor you criticize in believers. You've simply replaced God with your own intellect. A few attendees nodded vigorously. Even some who had initially sided with the professor were now completely engrossed in Vance's dismantling of their colleagues' arguments. But here's the most telling contradiction. Vance paused, his eyes locked with Dawkins. You claim that believing in God is a sign of lower intelligence, yet you're unable to counter even basic theological arguments from a politician. So which is it, Professor? Are believers intellectually inferior, or are you just intellectually unprepared? The silence was absolute. Professor Dawkins' mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His entire academic career had been built on intimidating others with his intellectual superiority. But now— And here's the question that I think will really demonstrate the flaw in your thinking, Vance said, his voice calm but powerful. You argue that faith in God is irrational, yet you have faith that consciousness arose from unconscious matter, that life emerged from non-life, that order came from chaos, all without any divine guidance. So tell me, Professor, which requires more blind faith, believing in a divine creator, or believing that nothing created everything? The look on Professor Dawkins' face made it clear he had no answer, and that's when he knew he had made a terrible mistake in challenging JD Vance's faith. The silence in the lecture hall was deafening. Professor Dawkins stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't come. Attendees leaned forward in their seats, waiting for his rebuttal to Vance's devastating logic. Well, that's not— Dawkins stammered, his academic prowess crumbling before everyone's eyes. His hands trembled slightly against the podium. The fact is, Professor, Vance continued, his voice still respectful but firm, your bias against faith isn't based on reason or evidence. It's based on prejudice. And prejudice, as you often teach, is the enemy of true intellectual discourse. That's when Dr. Chen chose to intervene. Perhaps, she called out, rising from her seat, we should move to the next segment of our panel. We have a lot of material to cover today. Vance, recognizing the mercy being offered to the humiliated professor, nodded graciously. Thank you for allowing me to share my perspective, Professor Dawkins, he said, turning to return to his seat. The senator's dignified exit only highlighted Dawkins's earlier rudeness. The professor stood at his podium, visibly shaken, watching as Vance walked back to his place. The other attendees' eyes followed him with newfound respect. Professor Dawkins attempted to continue his part of the panel, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. His hands shook as he shuffled his papers, and his eyes kept darting to where Vance sat, as if expecting another intellectual assault at any moment. For the next 30 minutes, Professor Dawkins attempted to contribute to the panel discussion, but the damage was done. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, now wavered with uncertainty. Every assertion made seemed to echo with his earlier humiliation. Attendees who had once hung on his every word were now stealing glances at Vance, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. A few were quietly taking notes, but not about the panel. They were recording what they had just witnessed. The modern approach to cognitive development. Dawkins's voice trailed off as he caught sight of Vance taking careful notes, the same composed expression on his face. The professor quickly looked away, losing his train of thought entirely. In the corner of the stage, Dr. Chen watched with a mix of sympathy and understanding. She had warned the panel about overly aggressive attacks on others' beliefs, but Dawkins had been too convinced of his own intellectual superiority to listen. The once mighty professor's hands trembled slightly as he referred to his notes. Words that he had confidently proclaimed hundreds of times before now seemed to mock him. Rational thinking in the modern age. The irony was lost on no one. An attendee raised her hand to ask a question about the material, but Dawkins flinched visibly, as if expecting another challenge to his worldview. The rest of the panel passed in a blur of stumbled explanations and uncomfortable silences. Not a single person in that lecture hall was thinking about the scheduled topic. They were all replaying the moment when a politician's unwavering faith and sharp intellect had systematically dismantled their academic hero's life's work. As the panel finally drew to a close, the usual shuffle of attendees packing their bags was accompanied by an unusual buzz of excited whispers. Groups were already forming, all discussing what they'd witnessed. "Did you see how he just... I've never seen anyone stand up to Dawkins like that." The way he stayed so calm while the Professor Dawkins barely managed to exit the stage, his usual authoritative closing remarks reduced to a mumbled, "We'll continue another time." His hands shook as he gathered his materials, avoiding eye contact with everyone. A small group of attendees who had previously laughed at his anti-religious jokes now stood awkwardly by the door, watching as their once intimidating intellectual hero seemed to physically shrink as he hurried toward the exit. "Senator Vance," one attendee called out as the politician headed for the exit. "That was incredible." Others nodded in agreement, some even applauding. Through it all, Vance maintained his humble demeanor, politely thanking them but refusing to revel in his opponent's humiliation. Dr. Chen approached her colleague, who was still frozen near the stage. "Richard," she said quietly, "perhaps this is an opportunity for some reflection." Dawkins just nodded, his eyes fixed on where Vance had been sitting. The senator's empty seat seemed to mock everything Dawkins had believed about faith, intelligence, and his own intellectual superiority. The question now wasn't whether he would change his approach to public speaking. It was how much of his worldview would survive this devastating encounter. As the conference concluded that afternoon, Professor Dawkins was seen sitting alone in the now empty lecture hall, staring at his notes. 40 years of mocking faith reduced to meaningless scribbles by a politician's unwavering conviction. "Excuse me, Professor." It was Vance stopping by before leaving. Dawkins looked up, his arrogance replaced by something new. Respect. "You know," Dawkins said quietly, "in all my years of teaching and debating, no one has ever made me question my own intellectual arrogance like you did today." Vance smiled graciously. "Sometimes the strongest arguments for faith are made by those who try to destroy it." The professor nodded slowly. "Maybe," he replied, "the truly closed minds aren't the ones who believe in God, but the ones who mock those who do." That day became legendary in academic and political circles, not just as the day when JD Vance defended his faith with extraordinary eloquence, but as proof that when truth meets arrogance, truth always wins. The video from that conference has circulated through every major university and political forum in America, reminding everyone that faith and intellect aren't enemies. They're allies in the search for truth. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. God bless you and God bless America.